So, as always with a new season, Riot has decided to shake up the jungle. With previous changes to jungle mechanics, the addition of pets, and so much more, it's left a lot of the player base wondering whether the opening route they're using is even viable anymore. Well, fret not. As always, we here at Skillcapped have been hard at work grinding the cesspool known as Start of Season solo queue. We've also been spending way too many caffeine-induced hours researching the top players, all so you don't have to. In this guide, we will not only be ranking every single route in the current meta, but also explaining the exact reasons why they're strong or weak, so you definitely do not want to miss this one. Before we do that though, we should outline exactly how we'll be determining the strength of a route. We'll be grading each jungle route based on 5 qualities. First is the consistency. For example, routes that have low risk and high reward will be weighted a bit higher than routes with a high risk and high reward. Second is adaptability. Routes that allow you to react to things on the map and pivot into more optimal choices will be considered stronger than ones that keep you limited. Third is difficulty of execution. The easier a route is to execute, the stronger it will be considered. Fourth is its champion pool. The more widely applicable the route is to more champions will cause it to be stronger than routes that can only be used on a select few. And finally, this tier list is aimed at players Diamond and below, as that is literally 99.7% of the entire player base. The reason why it's important to make that distinction is that some jungle routes are way stronger or weaker in Challenger than they would be in Gold, for example. This isn't the best routes in terms of high elo meta, it's what's best for the average player to climb with. Alright, and with that out of the way, let's jump into our rankings. Kicking us off is none other than the full clear. Extremely straightforward, all it involves is starting on one side of the map and clearing every single one of your camps along the way to the other. Now, the full clear was massively buffed in the new season for multiple reasons. Firstly, they actually increased the clear speed of every jungler by buffing the damage junglers due to camps. They basically buffed every camp to be tankier while also increasing the damage champions due to their own camps by 20%. In the end, the math ended up resulting in junglers clearing faster. Secondly, the Rift Scuttle's first spawn got pushed back from 3:15 to 3 minutes and 30 seconds. This meant that now every jungler could basically full clear and get to that first scuttle spawn in time. Compare this to the previous season, where there were only a select few champions that could full clear into getting to that first scuttle. Thirdly, the Krug camp got a massive buff. They removed the medium Krugs that spawn, and what this means is you now clear it very fast while still getting a ton of XP and gold from it. Now, if we were ranking routes on the first patch of the preseason, then the full clear would obviously go to the top of S tier. But there have been repeated nerfs to this route prior to the new season starting. Riot has repeatedly lowered treat gold on both patch 12.23 and 12.23b. So you're now getting a bit less gold from power farming. They also nerfed just general camp gold on patch 12.23b as well. They've also reduced the amount of damage pets do, helping to slow down clear speeds. And if this wasn't enough, a lot of champions that were amazing at full clearing have actually been getting repeated direct nerfs. Lilia, Dr. Mundo, Mordekaiser, Shyvana, Hecarim, etc. All of these have seen direct nerfs, and most of the times it was actually to their damage, trying to reduce their clear speed. With all that being said though, there are still a lot of positives to this route. It is quite literally the easiest route to execute, it is the most consistent as there's very little risk, and pretty much nearly every champion can use this route. And for those reasons, we're very confident in placing the full clear in the A tier at the moment. Now, before we jump into the next route, if you find this content that summarizes meta jungle routes helpful, then you're going to absolutely love our dedicated course on routes found on our website. The course begins with a quick start guide where we recommend routes for every jungle champion in the game. For example, let's say you play Elise and wanted to learn the route that we recommend when you start at your red. As you can see, it is a fast 3 camp. Then it's as simple as going to our fast level 3 video in the course to learn everything you need to know to start pathing like a pro. We not only have guides on every meta jungle route, but then each one of these guides is paired with a live commentary from a top challenger jungler teaching you how the best players in the world use the route. And remember, we're backed by a rank improvement guarantee where if you don't significantly improve while using Skillcapped, then you can just get your money back, no questions asked. That's not all though, as we're also offering a limited time discount in the description below. So click the discount link in the description below and start ranking up. Alright, so next up, we have a bit of a lesser known route. It's starting at your Raptors. This is nearly always done as a way to start your route without needing a leash from any of your laners. It does have several benefits to this. First, it means none of your laners will arrive to lane late, giving them an immediate advantage in lane. Secondly, it will hide you from the enemy jungler. Since they can't see which lane leashed, they won't know where you started. And third, it allows you to hit level 2 faster than starting at a buff. this can be beneficial in very niche scenarios, such as keeping yourself protected from a late invade on your buff, or setting you up for a super fast level 2 invade of your own. However, in the current meta, these benefits simply don't outweigh the negatives. For one, this route suffers from being very champion dependent. Champions like Evelynn, Kayn, and Bel'Veth can take Raptors very fast, and so this makes it viable on them. But completely forget it on single target champions like Warwick and Trundle, and even champions with some AoE in their kit like Graves. They won't clear Raptors fast enough to make it better than starting at a buff. It's also very limited in terms of adaptability. Once you start Raptors, it becomes extremely awkward to take your Krugs, since you'll be doing Raptors red into Krugs, and now either have to recall and head to the other side, or waste a ton of time walking all the way back across the map. It also creates an awkward respawn timing on your second rotation of camps. For example, if you did red Krugs into Raptors, well then, during the next rotation, the Krugs will spawn first, allowing you to be efficient with your movement as you clear from one side of the map to the other. When you start Raptors, your Raptors will spawn first in your second rotation, and again, this causes you to do that super inefficient movement, like Raptors into Krugs, then doubling back to head to the other side of the map. It's just not very good. Additionally, in ranks Diamond and below, the benefit of your laners not having to leash is simply reduced, as laners aren't good enough in these ranks to even know how to use that kind of advantage. The same applies to hiding your starting location. Enemy junglers simply aren't good enough to make use of that information correctly, and so revealing your starting location really isn't that big of a deal compared to games in Challenger. And this is why the Raptors Start is being placed in the C tier. Moving on, we have one of the oldest routes in the game, red Krugs into Raptors. This route has a lot going for it in the new season. As we mentioned earlier, Krugs got a massive buff as they're far faster to clear now. Last season, this was actually the biggest downside to this route, was how slow you'd be since you're committing to the Krugs immediately after you're red, but this is no longer the case. Additionally, as we mentioned in the last section, when you do red Krugs Raptors, you're immediately getting that starting quadrant cleared in an order that results in your second rotation being more efficient. You also hit level 3 off of Raptors while also having a red buff. This sets you up for extremely strong ganks or invades off this timing. It's also one of the most versatile routes in the game. After you complete red Krugs into Raptors, you can now pivot into a wide variety of variations depending on the game state. For example, you immediately have the option of transitioning gank mid lane. You could also do a 4 camp into a gank, or a 5 camp into a gank, and if there's nothing needing your attention on the map, you just fall back into a super efficient full clear. Really, the only current downside in the new season for this route is that some champions can struggle clearing Raptors efficiently, such as Warwick and Trundle. But still, with the addition of Pet's AoE damage, those single target champions don't have as much of an issue on the Raptor camp as prior seasons, so it's not as much of a downside as you think. So for all these reasons, the red Krugs Raptors route will be the first one placed into our S tier. Next up, we have routes that involve level 2 gank timings after you take your red buff. This can be starting at your red and then immediately ganking a side lane or mid lane, or it can be starting red, doing Krugs, then ganking a side lane, or starting red, doing Raptors, and you guessed it, ganking mid lane. Now, once upon a time, in a meta far, far away, this was actually a top tier route. This was all the way back in Season 8, when Riot made the Scuttle actually worth gold and experience, and yes, the Scuttle was worth only 10 experience before this patch. I'm not making this up, the initial spawn time was actually 2 minutes for the Scuttle. So doing a route like red, Krugs, gank a sideline, then take that Scuttle that's now worth a ton of XP, that ended up being a very potent route. Nowadays though, that's no longer the case. Trying to gank at level 2 is one of the riskiest things you can do as a jungler. To execute that gank, you're giving up camps you could be clearing, which not only makes you fall behind if the gank doesn't work, but also makes you fall behind since those camps you didn't clear are no longer respawning for your second rotation at a higher level where they'll be worth more. Additionally, most players don't realize that kills pretty much give 0 experience in the early game. This is because the experience you gain from champion kills is actually based on the enemy champion's level. For example, let's say you did red buff, then went off and ganked bot lane and actually got an assist. Well, guess what? You would gain 28 experience for getting an assist on a level 1 champion. This would then be split amongst the other player that assisted in the kill, so that's actually 14 experience. For comparison, your Gromp would give you 195 experience in your opening clear. This means even when the gank is successful, you'll still fall massively behind in experience. This isn't even mentioning that in the preseason, Riot introduced a new mechanic where junglers only get 75% XP from lane minions before their first pet evolution. Combine this with the reduced gold you get from lane minions if more than 40% of your gold comes from them, and suddenly, after you successfully gank a lane at level 2, you can no longer rely on soaking lane minions to help compensate for the camps that you're giving up. Not to mention, only a select few champions even have strong enough level 2s to make any kind of gank effective. For this reason, ganking level 2 is way too risky relative to its reward, and is why this is the first route to be placed in the F tier. Moving on, we have the route known as the fast level 3, which involves starting red, then doing Raptors into your Gromp. This route, as the name implies, is one of the fastest ways to hit level 3 in the game as a jungler. The reason it works is Gromp gives a disproportionate amount of experience compared to other camps, and so weaving it into your first 3 camps will always guarantee you hit level 3. We want to start at our red so we can get the additional ganking and fighting power from the red buff. We then do Raptors since it's the fastest camp for us to take, and then finish with Gromp for the XP boost needed to hit level 3. Now, although on the surface this route seems incredibly all-in and risky, it's actually extremely versatile. You see, after you finish red, Raptors into Gromp, you now have a ton of options. The really obvious one is just immediately go gank a lane. But you also have invades on the enemy's red buff if no ganks are available and you're just a strong level 3 jungler compared to a weak jungler. If there's no plays available at all, well, you can just go and farm your blue as an in-between move, and then reevaluate afterwards if there are any ganks or invades available. Again, if none are available, you can then move to farm your wolves as another in-between move, and reevaluate again. The nice thing about this is that after you finish your wolves, you can then choose whether to go for the nearby scuttle, or just pivot back to the side that you started on and take the scuttle there. This will allow you to either dodge the enemy jungler if he has lane priority or a winning jungle matchup, or try to force a fight over the scuttle if you're the one winning. The main downsides of it though is the fact that you're never going to do Krugs in this opening route, which means if there is truly no gank or invade available, it's less efficient than having just full cleared in that scenario. However, for many champions, that can actually be a strength. There are plenty of strong early game junglers like Warwick, Trundle, Kindred, who simply rarely want a full clear in their opening route, at least as a default. This fast level 3 route of doing red Raptors into Gromp offers them an aggressive opener while still giving them a very consistent and safe fallback plan. And again, this was already the go-to route of so many of those aggressive champions last season, but with the addition of the Jungle Pet's AoE damage, it means they can do Raptors even faster and healthier, making the route even better on them. Essentially, in the current meta of Season 13, if you're a champion with a strong early game, this route is a staple in your repertoire, and for that reason, we're placing it in the S tier. Moving on, we have a route I'm sure a lot of jungle veterans will recognize, the Predator route. This route is used on champions, surprise surprise, that run the Predator rune. You start at your Raptors, then do red into Krugs, you then recall, purchase boots, and head to your blue side jungle. Since you need boots to activate the Predator rune, this route is a way to achieve that. Unfortunately, this route has pretty much completely fallen out of the meta. Whether it's because other rune alternatives are simply too strong, or the Predator rune is too weak, we'll leave that for the comment section to decide. Simply though, no jungle champions at the moment are running the Predator rune in their builds, making this route basically completely pointless. And for that reason, we are placing the Predator route in the F tier. Next up, we have another classic route, starting at blue, then doing Gromp into wolves. This route has a lot going for it, mainly that nearly every other alternative when you start at blue kind of completely sucks. For example, Gromp is such an important camp to take, given how much experience it gives compared to anything else, and is what allows us to hit level 3 off of 3 camps. It's pretty much always incorrect to skip it. This means if you start at blue, you're now locked in to at least doing blue into Gromp. Any other alternative would just be way too inefficient. Now, after you do Gromp, you theoretically do have a choice. You could skip wolves and head to your red side jungle camps instead. The problem with this is that none of those options are really better than just simply doing wolves. For one, by doing blue Gromp into wolves, we've now perfectly synced the respawn timers of that quadrant. This means farming the second rotation of our camps is going to be much more efficient. It also allows us to hit level 3 off of doing wolves, allowing us to transition into our red side jungle much safer than if we were level 2. If an enemy tries to invade us, well, we'll always be level 3 to defend it, compared to if we skip wolves, well, we'll be sitting there level 2. It also keeps us very versatile. If we do blue, Gromp, and skip wolves, well, at that point we've removed full clearing as an option. However, once you do blue Gromp into wolves, you can then make several different choices based on the game state. If you see potential ganks, you can just immediately go into taking your red buff into ganking. If no ganks are available, you can do Raptors into red buff for a slower route. And again, after that red buff, we can then decide whether to gank or instead continue to our Krugs to then do a full clear. So given that in the current meta, if a champion starts at their blue buff, the vast majority of the time they're doing blue Gromp into wolves, as it's simply the best option for the reasons listed, we have to place this into the S tier. Now, with all of that being said though, this next route is really the only other current alternative in the meta if you do start at blue. And that's to do blue Gromp into your red. So, remember how we just talked about how the biggest downside of skipping your wolves when you do blue into Gromp is you're excluding your ability to fall back on a full clear? Well, there are just some champions that don't care about this, as they never intended to ever full clear. A good example of this would be an aggressive early game ganker like Elise. If a champion like Elise starts at their blue buff, they really value spiking level 3, having their red buff, and being on the map to gank fast. Doing a route like blue Gromp into wolves will slow this down, since you often want to kill your red buff afterwards in order to get that power of the buff for your ganks. Skipping wolves will solve this issue. We can do blue Gromp into our red buff, hit level 3 super fast, and have double buffs at the same time. Another good way of understanding why someone would do this is to compare it to the fast level 3 that we went over earlier. If you start at your blue buff and the enemy starts on the same side as you at their red buff, well, they have the option of doing a fast level 3 route, where they do red Raptors into Gromp. If you do blue Gromp wolves into red, you'll always be behind the enemy jungler. They'll get the first gank off as you cleared 4 camps to their 3. In these types of scenarios, where you're on an aggressive early game ganking jungler and pathing to the same side as the enemy jungler, skipping wolves can actually end up being a big difference maker. However, all of this is very situational. I mean, you have to be on a select few champions that want to path that fast, and you need to identify that the earlier gank is actually needed on the lanes you're pathing towards, and or the enemy jungler could path faster than you since he started on the same side of his red, and that's an actual threat. For these reasons, it just makes the most sense to place this route in the B tier. Next up, we have the route known as the 4 camp. This can be done starting from either buff. For example, if you started at your blue buff, a 4 camp would be blue Gromp wolves into red. If you started at your red buff instead, a 4 camp could look like red Krugs Raptors into your blue. Technically, you can even 4 camp out of the fast level 3 route we talked about earlier. This would involve you doing red Raptors Gromp into blue. The 4 camp is never really a route you set out to do at the start of the game, and instead is something you pivot into based on the information on the map. For example, if we do blue Gromp wolves, well, then as we transition to our red side jungle, we could see that there's a potential gank opportunity on the side lane there. Well, if we skip Raptors in that situation, get our red buff for the additional gank power, and then look to gank, that would actually be a 4 camp. If we started at our red into Krugs, then Raptors, as we transition to our blue side jungle, again, we could see there's a potential gank opportunity on the side lane. In this case, we could actually gank immediately since we already have a red buff, but perhaps we're waiting for the next wave to arrive or something like that. We then take our blue buff or Gromp as an in-between move while we wait for that next wave, and then we gank it. This again would be a 4 camp. The biggest downside of the 4 camp is that as soon as we pivot into it, we've now removed a lot of efficiency from being able to full clear. Additionally, it can actually be quite hard to execute. You have to have good map awareness and decision making to know when to execute it. This would make you think that it belongs somewhere maybe in the C tier. However, keep in mind, the 4 camp can actually be pivoted into from every single one of the routes in the S tier. This is why it makes a lot more sense to place it in the B tier. And this also makes perfect sense to transition into the 5 camp as our next route. This can be done starting from either buff. For example, if you started at your blue, you would do blue Gromp wolves Raptors and then red buff, and you would gank instead of doing your Krugs. If you started at your red buff, you would do red Krugs Raptors wolves Gromp and then gank instead of doing your blue buff. By the way, you skip your blue here because Gromp is faster, gives more experience, and you want to sync up all your minor camp respawn timers together. You can, once again, even do this if you executed the fast level 3 we talked about earlier. Doing red Raptors Gromp, then doing blue into wolves, and then typically going for a scuttle spawn. And, surprise, just like the 4 camp in the previous section, the 5 camp is never really a route you set out to do at the start of the game. Instead, it's something you pivot into based on the information on the map. However, it arguably has a bit more downsides than the 4 camp. Once you've cleared 5 camps, you're only 1 away from full clearing, which will get you a level 4 spike. So by ganking after 5 camps, you're really giving up a lot more. Additionally, that gank timing isn't as early as the other faster routes, and so for example, if you're facing a fast clearer, you could actually hit a gank at the same time as an enemy jungler who already full cleared and is level 4 compared to your level 3. And again, since you're never setting out to 5 camp at the start of the game, this means it's harder to execute. You'll need that good map awareness and decision making to know in what situations you should pivot into it. However, given that the 5 camp can also be pivoted into from each of the S tier routes, it just wouldn't make any sense to place it any lower than the B tier. Next up, we have our first invade route. This is late invading the enemy's red buff when you're on the red team. The distinction of what team you're on is actually incredibly important. For one, in ranks Diamond and below, easily, over 70% of the time, the enemy jungler will start on the bot side of the map as they prefer to get that stronger bot lane leash. This means the majority of the time when you late invade, you'll run into that enemy team, which is what you actually want if you're executing this route. Additionally, since you're invading the bot side of the map, you'll have your bot lane with you during this invade. This means you'll have more damage to focus fire and kill an enemy champion once you turn that corner at their red buff. Also, just a lot of support champions actually have great forms of crowd control at level 1 to help set up the invade. Compare this to when you invade the enemy's red buff as the blue team. You'll only be late invading with your top laner, and so you'll have less damage and crowd control to quickly turn the fight in your favor. Alright, the late invade on the enemy's red buff as the red team is actually incredibly powerful, and it's for several reasons. For one, the terrain allows you to walk straight into the enemy taking red buff while still being in a brush. This makes setting up kills incredibly easy. Second, junglers Diamond and below will have no idea how to properly react to this invade. Meanwhile, if you're the one consistently executing this route, you'll be way more experienced and just know the best follow-ups. And third, that follow-up you can execute off this invade can literally win you the game in like 5 minutes. Assuming the invade was successful, you take the enemy's red buff, then take their raptors, and then execute a transition gank on mid lane. This transition gank on mid either gets you a kill or guarantees you lane priority for your follow-up invade. After the transition gank mid, you invade the enemy's blue buff. You'll be level 2 with a red buff compared to their level 1. Often, you'll just kill them at this point and then steal their blue side jungle, and the game is completely over for them. This route is absolutely insanely strong when executed successfully, but that's kind of also its main weakness. First of all, you need to late invade, not invade at the start of the game. If you invade immediately, you can run into enemies just stacked in a brush waiting for you. At the same time, if there's a ward and you invade too early, the enemy jungler will just leave and go to your red buff and steal it to equalize the position. That's why you typically want to wait in the tri-brush in the river and start invading at 120 or a little bit later. However, trying to get a bunch of solo queue players to follow those instructions, well, it's not exactly consistent. Similarly, once you do invade and the fight starts, you better hope none of your teammates just start running away or massively misplaying. It's also risky since if the fight goes poorly and you die, well, now the enemy actually has red buff and is level 2, and he's the one who can invade you and make your life a living hell. The good news is the chances that a random solo queue jungler, Diamond and below, actually knows the proper follow-up to punish you if you do fail is pretty low. On top of all of this route's effectiveness can widely vary based on not only your champion, but also your bot laners. Late invading with a Blitz or Nautilus support while playing a strong level 1 jungler like Graves or Kindred, well, that's going to go a whole lot better than invading with a Janna support while playing Shyvana. With all that being said though, this is a route that our challenger experts have tested extensively in ranks Diamond and below, and it's more consistent than it seems on paper. Basically, your teammates, they won't mess up as much as you'd think. Despite all the risk, the reward is simply way too high when executed successfully, and so we're placing this route in the A tier. We highly recommend you give this one a shot if you've never tried it before. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Now, it only makes sense that our next route is then the blue team equivalent of the invade. This is where you late invade the enemy's red buff when you're on the blue side. This route is basically identical to everything we just covered in the previous section, with 2 key differences though. One, as we mentioned, junglers often start bot side, and so this late invade, the vast majority of the time, it's going to result in you stealing their red buff, which is nowhere near as effective as both stealing the red buff and killing the jungler. Second, you only have your top laner as you invade, and so it's less likely you'll have the damage or crowd control necessary to actually get a kill. This additional time the fight goes on for can also result in the enemy mid laner rotating to help out, or just simply the enemy jungler not dying and getting to safety, resulting in the subsequent follow-up not being as powerful. Still, if you do run into the enemy jungler and win that fight and steal his buff, well, it can be just as game-winning as the previous invade route. We can then steal his raptors, transition gank mid, into then invading his blue side jungle. Since this basically just acts as a weaker version of the previous route, it makes sense to place it in the B tier. And with us praising late invading red buffs so much, you may be wondering, what about late invading an enemy blue buff instead? Well, that's our next route. You may think it's equal in strength, but unfortunately it is not. This has to do with the terrain differences between the red buff and blue buff. When you late invade a red buff, you have a brush you can move into as you turn the corner. It is very rare that any enemy champions sit in this brush as they damage the red buff, and so you often get to set up a perfect engage from Fog of War. However, that brush doesn't really exist at the blue buff. Instead, as you turn the corner, you'll often get spotted for a second right before you enter the brush. Additionally, the terrain around the blue buff often results in the enemy being in a safer position. The bot lane will often give leashes hugging towards that bottom side of the map so they can get to lane faster. This results in being much further away from you. Compare this to the red buff, where they instead are often leaning towards you, as players often take this path to lane. The same idea applies to the jungler, where when they take blue buff, they often kite back towards the Gromp. This makes it super easy to spot you as you turn the corner during your late invade. Whereas with the red buff, it's much more common for them to kite it right in front of the brush you'll be hiding in, so that they can either move towards Krugs next, or so that their bot lane simply gets to lane faster. If all of this wasn't bad enough, the follow-up to this route, if it is successful, is also much weaker. When you kill the enemy jungler into stealing his red, you can then steal his raptors into that transition gank and invading his blue quadrant. However, when late invading blue buffs, you now have to take a Gromp instead of raptors, which just takes a lot longer to kill. Additionally, the transition gank on mid actually comes from a very bad angle. You really only have one angle to go from, and it puts you inside of the tower very early on, allowing the enemy mid laner to spot you and back off to safety. Compare this to when you do the red invade, you can actually hug this wall here and be completely out of range of the tower's vision and just suddenly pop up behind the enemy mid laner, increasing the success of the gank. Overall, when it comes to late invading the blue buff, you basically still have all the risk we just covered in the previous section, but now you just get less out of it. And for that reason, we're placing this route in the C tier. Next up, we have a route I'm sure very few players even know about, but it's actually completely legitimate, and it's to start at the enemy's Raptors. So similar to the previous late invades that we've talked about, this involves waiting in the tri-brush and then moving in at around 120. However, instead of late invading the enemy's red buff, which requires teammates in subsequent fights, we instead sneakily steal the enemy's Raptor camp away from them. This then branches out into some very cool variations that are unexpected. For one, assuming you're a champion with any kind of semi-decent clear speed on the Raptor camp, you can then hit level 2 off this Raptor camp and then check their red buff after. If the enemy started red, they'll actually still be level 1, and you can either smite steal the red from them or just straight up look to fight them and kill them with your level advantage. This obviously will then have the same powerful follow-ups we just mentioned, where you can transition gank mid into invading their blue quadrant. At the same time, if you turn that corner after Raptors and the enemy isn't on their red buff, well, then you just steal their red. You then leave to head back to your jungle, having stolen 2 camps without the enemy knowing. And on the surface, this does just sound like a better version of the other late invade routes, but unfortunately, there are some downsides. For one, the champion you're playing becomes much more important. For example, level 1 late invading with a strong early game champion like Trundle or Warwick can, well, work out great. But imagine trying to steal an enemy Raptor camp as Trundle or Warwick, who are single target champions, into then getting to the enemy's red buff in time before he kills it. It's just highly unlikely. Often the types of champions that are good at clearing Raptor camps don't have the most amazing level 2 spikes. So this somewhat narrows down the pool of viable champions that want to use this route. Additionally, there's a lot more risk involved if you do end up fighting the enemy jungler. Usually, they'll be getting a leash, right? And so, since you solo invaded, it means as the fight starts, the enemy side laner will be in a much closer position to react to that fight than yours. This pretty much makes this invade route too risky to use when you're on the red team, since you'll be invading into a bot lane leash, which will result in the red dying just much faster, often missing the timing we've talked about, and the enemy jungler being higher in health, etc. And so, realistically, you're really only limited to executing it when you're on the blue team. Still, despite all of these downsides, pretty much no jungler will ever expect this route, I promise you. Most won't even know it exists, and when you pull it off, you can pretty much win the game in 5 minutes. And so, for those reasons listed, we think that B tier makes the most sense for its ranking. And next up, we have a level 2 same side invade route. This has 2 main variations. The first, you start red, then just immediately invade the enemy's blue side jungle. This is great on champions who can jump the wall behind red buff, who have strong level 2 invades like Nidalee and Graves. You make sure to save your smite, and then if the enemy started blue, you simply beat them 1v1 at their Gromp while also looking to steal it with your smite. The other variation to this route is to start red and then do Raptors and then invade the enemy's blue side jungle. This is a very thin timing, and it's only done on champions who can clear Raptors fast enough that they can still hit the enemy Gromp in time to steal it and fight the enemy jungler. The nice thing about this route though is that if the enemy starts at their red buff instead, well then you can just steal their Gromp and blue buff before either choosing to fight them near their wolves or just transition back into farming your jungle. Junglers with very strong level 2s like Kindred, Graves, Nidalee, Trundle, etc., well, they can use this route to great effect, especially against weaker farming junglers. For example, imagine a Shyvana starting at blue buff, moving on to Gromp, then suddenly a red buffed Graves shows up to either kill her or push her out of the jungle. This completely disrupts her full clear and now sets the farming jungler behind. The main downside to this route is there's really only a select few early game champions that are able to run it. Overall though, a very solid route, especially as a counter to a lot of the farming junglers you can run into in the current meta at the moment, and that's why we'll be placing it in the A tier. And for our last route, we have something similar. We have a level 2 into invading the opposite side that you started on. So, similar to the previous route, we started our red buff, but instead of invading their blue, we immediately head to their red buff to steal it. The other variation would be doing red, then Raptors, and then invading the enemy's red buff. It's worth noting, this route is only possible if the enemy jungler starts at their blue. On the surface, this does seem pretty decent. We grab our red buff, which boosts our fighting power, while the enemy will only have a blue buff. However, there are severe downsides to executing this route. Firstly, you actually don't run into the enemy jungler. This is because when a jungler starts at their blue, they will most likely be doing blue, Gromp into wolves. They will hit level 3 off of this. Meanwhile, if you do red, Raptors into invading their red buff, you'll have to kill an additional 4th camp to hit level 3. This means you often just end up running into an enemy jungler that's a higher level than you. Alternatively, you could try to do something like starting at your red, then immediately stealing the enemy's Raptors into their red buff, and then heading back into your own jungle. But that is a very large time investment in terms of movement for not a lot of farm. Additionally, once you steal their camps, you'll again have the exact same problem of still being level 2, requiring you to farm an additional camp to hit level 3. Overall, this will put you severely behind in tempo on the enemy jungler, who will be level 3 and ready to impact the map despite losing their red buff. Given that you can only execute this route in very specific conditions, you starting at red and the enemy starting blue, that you have to give up your ability to hit early gank timings, syncing up your camps, and clearing them for a second rotation efficiently, all of this just to steal a single camp from the enemy, possibly 2, This simply isn't a very good route compared to alternative options, which is why we're placing it in the F tier. Alright, and there you have it, every single route in the current meta ranked. Did we miss any routes? Disagree with some of our rankings? Let's discuss it in the comments section below. And remember, if you found this guide helpful, then you'll absolutely love our dedicated course on routes found on our website. The course begins with a quick start guide where we recommend routes for every jungle champion in the game. So for example, let's say you play Elise and wanted to learn the route we recommend when starting at your red. As you can see, it's a fast 3 camp. Then it's as simple as going to our fast level 3 video in the course to learn everything you need to know to start pathing like a pro. We not only have guides on every meta jungle route, but each one of these is then paired with a live commentary from a top challenger jungler teaching you how the best players in the world use the route. Keep in mind, we are backed by a rank improvement guarantee where if you don't significantly improve while using skill capped, you can get your money back, no questions asked. That's not all though, as we're also offering a limited time discount link in the description below. So click the discount link in the description below and start ranking up. Alright, and we here at Skill Capped want to thank you for watching until the end, and we'll catch you in the next one.